Good afternoon. Welcome everyone. I'm Wenhong Chen, the faculty organizer of the Global Media Industries Speaker Series. It's my great honor and pleasure today to introduce you first Dr. Jay Bernhardt, Dean of the Moody College of Communication at the University of Texas at Austin, one of the largest and highest ranked colleges of communication in the country, and I believe also in the world. An internationally recognized high impact scholar and practitioner of health communication, Dr. Bernhardt has a unique and outstanding career across academia, the public and the private sectors. From 2005 to 2010, Dr. Bernhardt led health communication and marketing at the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC. Many of our Moody students and the faculty can attest how lucky we are to have Jay as our dean during this global pandemic. Jay?
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that so much, Wenhong. It's a pleasure to welcome everybody to today's presentation and speaker, and it's a real honor for me to be one of the people welcoming you. I did spend earlier some time of my career at the CDC, and as I like to say sometimes, this is not my first pandemic, but hope everybody's safe and well and coping as best as they can under the very challenging circumstances we all find ourselves in, and I hope to continue, hope your work is continuing as well as it can as well. I have the distinct honor of welcoming everybody. Let me first again say thank you, Professor Chen, for the really nice introduction. Delighted that you're all joining us today for the Global Media Industries Speaker Series kickoff this year. The goal of the series is to learn about the latest trends in technology and media industries, and it brings together leading scholars from throughout the country and the world to share with us their observations and learnings and wisdom. And also it's a great chance to help facilitate professional development for our students here at UT Austin and at Moody College. I want to take a moment to thank the sponsors of the series. The Graduate School's Fund for Academic Enrichment is one of our supporters. So thank you to the Graduate School, Department of Radio, Television, Film, the Center for Entertainment and Media Industries, and also the School of Journalism and Media here in Moody College are all supportive and responsible for helping to make this happen. I also want to recognize a few of our doctoral students who help host and organize this. Maria Skoras and Josh Shao are our two student organizers. Thank you for your hard work putting this together. We appreciate you and what you do to help bring information to other students and all of us today. The series is part of our Center for Entertainment and Media Industries, which is co-directed by Wenhong Chen and also Professor Lisa Perrin. So we thank them for their fine work. The center is also the home for the Media Industry Minor, which is one of the fastest growing minors in Moody and beyond. And for undergraduate students, we think a great way to learn more about these really important fields that are so central and critical to the present, but especially the future. I'm personally particularly excited with today's speaker, Rainie, who will be formally introduced by Dr. Chen in just a moment, because I know his work quite well. In my time as a scholar of health communication and as a practitioner of health communication, I chatted with him a moment ago and shared that he and his colleague, Susanna Fox, are probably the most referenced citations in my published work over my career. They have been groundbreaking visionaries, I think, in understanding the internet as it was being created and as it started and expanded and changed our world in so many ways, many for the good, some for the not so good, but nonetheless, he has been at the forefront of documenting and measuring and assessing what exactly that means, especially looking at issues of disparities and access issues. And I think it's just such important work. So I'm thrilled and honored to be welcoming him as the inaugural speaker this year. So with that, welcome, Lee. I now hand the program back to Professor Chen to make the formal introduction. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Jay, for seeing these welcoming words at the kickstart of our speaker series. It's now my great pleasure to introduce you to our first speaker in the speaker series for academic year 2020-2021. Rainie is the director of the Internet and Technology Research at Pew Research Center, a nonprofit, non-partisan fact tank that studies the social impact of the Internet. Under Lee's leadership, the project has issued more than 750 reports based on its surveys that examine the social impact of the Internet, mobile phone, and social media on the American life. The American Sociological Association awarded Lee its award for excellence in the Reporting on Social Issues Award in 2014. Prior to launching the Pew Internet Project, Lee was managing director of the U.S. News and World Report. His topic today is the American life in the midst of crisis, a very timely topic, as you may see. So Lee, now we turn to you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to start sharing. Let's see, can you enable me to share my screen? And I will tell you all, first of all, this seems like a wonderful group, and it seems like a great size for us to be talking a lot rather than me lecturing and then doing a Q&A session. So please interrupt me as I go along if you have questions to ask. And you know, that'll be fun, and I'll actually discharge my duty as a speaker in this series, probably better answering your questions than telling you what we've got. The other thing that to know is that I have a history with Dr. Chen. She was involved about a decade ago in a wonderful piece of work that we did looking at network workers. We did a lot of social networking analysis during the late aughts and into 2009, 10, 11, 12, around there. And she was really instrumental in helping us do some really smart work around how technology was serving the purposes of American employees. And so we have a past to answer for, and it's fun. Is my screen showing up yet?
Josh?
I'm sorry, it's just share there. Okay.
Wonderful.
And I will, you will see that we have gone crazy basically since the beginning of the pandemic, looking at the major things that are going on in the culture. So starting in March and April, the way the pandemic was playing out in our culture and around the world. Then after the George Floyd killing, we started to pay a lot of attention to social justice protests and the cultural consequences of them. And forever, even before both of those things started, we were making special plans to cover the 2020 election because we knew that it would be important, and we knew that some of the things that were in evidence in 2016 would be amplified and on steroids in this campaign. So we were already planning to do some very special things related to the election season. So three big things are going on, and that's why I've titled this presentation about three crises that are going on in the culture. And for the students who are attending this, I thought I'd give a public service announcement. All of Pew Research's survey data is available for free. You can download the data sets from our site. The special thing that we're doing this year is this Pathways project that we began last November to look at the essentially the media diets of individual Americans. We have about 11,000 people now on a representative panel of United States adults. And we are intentionally looking at their media diets, their use of technology, their knowledge about campaign issues, their attention to campaign issues. And we're marrying that data with the things that we already know about our panelists. So one of the big changes in our life is we run panels now rather than telephone surveys. And so for all of our panelists, each of those 11,000 people, we know not only about their media diet, but about their political persuasion and their values judgments. We know a lot about their technology use. We know a lot about their spiritual lives, because we have a special unit inside Pew that looks at religion and its impact on public life. We know a lot about their basic demographics. And so this Pathways project was meant to aggregate all that stuff, but do it in a special way. It was to focus on media diets. But unlike past eras in Pew, we are releasing our data sets almost at the same time we are collecting them. So usually, as we have done our work in the past, we do our survey, we do our own reports and analysis, and then about 6 months to a year after we've collected the data, we release the data sets. In this case, we're releasing the data almost within days of when we collect it, after we cleaned it and collected it. And we release it in two ways. One of we built this tool for people like you who can do a lot of interesting analytical work, but for the general population, we've built this tool to allow people to sort of scroll through our data sets and make their own sort of customized data examinations. And so you'll see, if you go to this website, you'll see that we give people sort of pre-ordered topics, as well as pre-ordered demographic slices of the data, including partisanship, so that they can go through this material. And we're releasing the data before, in some cases, we've actually published off it. So we're inviting scholars to scoop us if they feel like doing it that way. But we're certainly doing it in a way where we're trying to serve the stakeholder community, sort of at the top of the list, scholars and other researchers who might be interested in playing with these data. That material comes on top of the longstanding practice at Pew to release our survey data sets in each of the 10 areas where we do research. So if you go to this link on our website, you will see that you can download everything that you want, but you can also customize it by the domains that you're interested in. You have to there's a registration process for doing that, and we only do that so that we know who is using our data. And in case there are things that are mistakes in the data, we can reach back to you and point out the mistakes, or if we've weighted the data an incorrect way, we've recalculated the weights or anything like that. Plus, we're pretty darn interested in who's using our material, and we'd really be interested to know if you find anything useful in it, or if you find that we've made mistakes with it. There's a fact-checking and accountability element of the process built into that. The thing that I'm going to talk to you about today is sort of a panoramic examination of most of the material we've gathered since March and April. Some cases, the top slides are going to be things we've released in the past 2 or 3 weeks. And so it'll have a little bit of a scattershot feel to it, but it will be what I hope is a relatively comprehensive picture of the state of the culture and the state of Americans and what they're thinking about the 3 big things that are going on in the culture: the pandemic, the social justice protests, and the election itself. Again, please interrupt me. I can't see the chat column here, so maybe Wenhong, you can be monitoring it to see if there are questions to break in, or just shout. You know, I'm happy to be interrupted and back up through stuff or explain more about stuff, because this is it's because there are so many topics I'm trying to cover. This is a very sort of top line sense of things. There's a lot of sort of partisan analysis of the data, so we can tell you how Republicans and Democrats are different, which is a lot of the interesting part of the story. But there are other things that I can tell you if you're particularly interested in them. So the headline, of course, is that we are a very angry and demoralized culture. This was a reality that predated the arrival of the pandemic and the social justice movement related to that. But since the movement has come about, we have been looking at the state of the culture, and we oftentimes have trend data on it. And you can see that the level of dissatisfaction certainly is higher than it's been in recent years, but it's almost at record high levels based on longstanding trends that both the Pew Research Center and the Gallup organization, from which we are sort of a our founding president used to be the president of Gallup. So a lot of times we use Gallup questions when we want to go back into the 1950s and 1960s to get trend data. But this is a stark reminder of how badly people are thinking about the state of their nation. When I'm moving my screen around, is that showing up on your screens, or is it just showing up on my screen? I'm trying to move my my pictures of you folks around so that I can see my data. Is that screwing you up? No. Yes. No. Oh, okay. Good. Okay. So when we ask about the mood of the country, angry is in first place, fearful is in second place, hopeful is about 50% of the population, and 17% are proud. So it's not in good shape. We actually just in the past 10 days released something that's been a long-standing trend of ours going back to, you'll see, the year 2000. We've been doing international work related to globalization and geopolitics. This year, we were only able to do our surveys in the summer using telephone polls. We didn't, oftentimes we do them in face-to-face polls, but we did not want to put respondents and the poll takers in any extra jeopardy. So we only did it in countries that have a polling capacity, telephone polling capacity. So you will see that there are no middle income or emerging economy countries on this list. This is all advanced economies. But the thing we put out, and one of the standard questions we ask is, what do you think of the United States? And what do you think of the President of the United States? And the thing that we put out 10 days ago shows record levels of disapproval of the United States, and record, well, Trump has his own sense of disapproval. You can see in that right column there. But in a bunch of countries, including the UK, France, Germany, Japan, and Canada, and Australia, these are record low numbers. We have never seen numbers since 2000, even at the height of the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, and things like that. We have not seen readings at this low point for the United States. And of course, as a person, the president has a low reputation in most places in the world. In years gone by, when we've been able to do this face-to-face surveys in places like Russia and Israel, there were relatively high confidence numbers for Trump, but in most advanced economies in particular, there are relatively low ratings about the confidence in the President of the United States. This is also a country where people don't think things are going well, and people don't think the president is doing a particularly good job. As the pandemic broke, you could see that there were some big changes in the disapproval ratings related to the president and the partisan nature of that. So Republicans were less likely to approve of the president's performance, but it was still 3/4 of them in the most recent survey we did about a month ago. Only 5% of Democrats are giving him high approval ratings. And of course, what you can imagine, if you extend that line off back to the left, approval and disapproval is always deeply tied to partisanship. Democrats generally like things when their people are in the White House, and Republicans generally like things when their people are in the White House. So there's a fluidity to these ratings that is very deeply tied to partisanship. And actually, it's worth pausing at this moment to speak about that long-term trend, because it ties to another big thing that is now determinative in our work. Over the past 10 years, we've seen the rise of what the political scientists or the politically aware folks in the room will know as effective polarization. People don't only think that the people in the other party have bad ideas, they think they're bad people. And it's carried over into a lot of judgments about the personal traits of people in the other party. It is now, and most importantly for the purposes of this conversation, knowing someone's partisan affiliation is the single strongest determinant of knowing where they stand on issues, where they stand on general trends in the culture, where they have landed on issues related to the pandemic and racial protests. It is 3 times more, knowing their partisanship is 3 times more powerful than knowing their educational attainment, knowing their race, knowing their gender, knowing their age, and knowing their knowledge about the subjects at hand. So that we've I don't know that this is unprecedented in social science, but it's certainly unprecedented in the era of polling, that we now see that partisan affiliation sort of trumps, my deliberate pun there, the judgments that people bring to the state of their culture and the way that they assess information. So the first screen through which they pass their thinking about information, news, and things like that is it good for my team or is it bad for my team? And all their judgments about its worthiness, its quality, its truthfulness, and the valence it should have in the culture are deeply tied now to partisanship, which is, again, something we've never seen in our work in the culture, certainly at this level. This is not really a super up to the moment horse race set of judgments. So this was in late June of this year, and we don't do as much horse race polling as we used to for a variety of reasons that if you care, I can talk about them. But at that point, Biden was leading Trump 54-44, and these are the basic demographic breaks related to that. It's, they are familiar to you. Whites are different from Black Americans and Hispanics. Well, by the way, I should add that in some of our newer material now, we are able to add Asians to our demographics. We didn't used to be able to have as many cases as we wanted to do that analysis. We now do. In this particular case, we weren't able to include the numbers, but I can get you those numbers if they matter to you, because it's now a big enough cohort that we are able to talk about it at least at the national level. We can't give you statewide data that are particularly powerful on this yet, but at the national level we can. There are age differences related to partisanship. Now one of the most interesting stories in partisanship is that the educational attainment of respondents is a deep determinant of people's partisanship, but it's flipped from the way that it used to be a generation or two ago, where the most educated folks in America tended to skew a little bit more Republican than Democrat. It's now very strongly the case that the more education you have, the more likely it is you're a Democrat. So it's a major cultural change. And one that we've documented as much as anybody else has. That ends our partisanship thing. That's actually a decent moment to break off and see if anybody has any questions. And you can tell I'm a native New Yorker, and then I moved to Washington. So I'm a child of the two worst speaking cultures in the United States. I speak fast and I speak long. And so I try to modulate myself by asking every once in a while how I'm doing. Are there any questions?
I think Rusty have a question, right? Josh, can you unmute Rusty?
Sorry, I had a question in terms of the data that's reported for folks who don't fit into a lot of the categories that Pew reports. So for folks who don't follow the binary, who don't fall into binary gender categories, or for those like you were talking about Asian American, but those who are even beyond white, Black, Hispanic, and Asian. So what about indigenous and Middle Eastern and North African constituents?
Right. Thank you so much for that. Up until a month ago, we were using the gender binary question that was a standard on the census and a lot of other instruments. We have moved now to offering a non-binary option. And just as I think as the Census Bureau is intending to do in the not very distant future. So in Pew reports that will start coming out maybe as early as mid-October, certainly late October, you will be able to see that as a separate classification of ours. The other thing to say is that those folks were always in our samples. These are representative of all adults, just as all the other groups that you cited, indigenous populations, North Africans, they're included in the population there, but we don't have enough sample size to report independently the data. Our sort of minimal cutoff is if we have 100 cases, 100 essential sample size cases. So usually that means about 300 respondents for us. But if they, after you've done the weighting of the data, if they turn out to be 100 or more cases, we report on that. And so again, we will start reporting the Asian numbers, and actually we're reporting them now in a bunch of our findings. And you will be able to see it in our data sets, even the current ones, who fall into those other populations. We just don't report them in a public way because we don't feel that they are statistically robust enough to do so.
Thank you.
I have another question.
Yeah.
Can you explain more about how Pew Research Center gets its sampling method? Like, how do you know it's representative of the population? That your sample represents the population that you're trying to get at?
Yep, good for you. Well, up until 2017, the vast majority of work at Pew was telephone polls that were done in the classic random digit dial way. So it was a polling methodology that was enshrined in the 60s and refined over the years to come, and so we using telephone sampling lists or telephone master lists, we extracted sample that was representative, we hoped, by all the major census demographics. But even in phone polls, you don't get the exact proportion of people in a standard phone poll that are the census tells you are representative of those groups. So you weight the data to true them up to the census proportions that they have. And so that's the pre-2017 story for Pew. We have moved now to a panel of, again, sort of those 11,000 people. In the phone polling era, we usually talk to between 1,500 and 2,500 people, but it became prohibitively expensive to do phone polling, and response rates began to plummet so much that we worried about the representativeness of the samples. And so we do a variety of methods to recruit for our panel. We recruit from phone polling, we do address-based sampling, we do particular targeting now to populations that we know are underrepresented in the existing sampling. So for instance, this summer, we spent a lot of time doing several things with the Hispanic representation on our staff. On our surveys, we tried to get more people who were more comfortable speaking Spanish in our surveys than speaking English in our surveys, which we know is a variable that matters. And so we did that. We also wanted to find Hispanics with lower levels of education, which is also a population that's been harder to find. And we also wanted to find non-internet users, because those are particularly in panel surveys where we're administering the survey on the web. Sometimes in the case of non-internet users, we give them tablet computers and ask them to respond to a link that they go to. It's always a question about replenishing our survey with non-internet users, because about 10% of Americans aren't using the internet. And so we want to make sure we understand them better. And we wanted to get a little bit more diversity in the Muslim and as well North African and other populations in our survey. Again, we won't be able to report those data, but we do some special work related to those populations that are individual surveys. So we wanted to get better at that. And so we do address-based recruiting. We piggyback onto phone polls that others are doing to make sure that we've found people that are not necessarily findable. And we do target populations that we know we'd love to have a bit more representation on the panel. I hope that's responsive.
Thank you.
As a matter of fact, we do elaborate methodologies in our surveys, and I'm gonna send Wenhong a link to our methodologies page, and you'll probably OD on all of the information you get there about how we do our sampling.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Before we go on, this is Joe Strauber. I wonder if I could ask a question about the global images of the U.S. poll. I've always been grateful that you guys do that. That was actually my second professional job. I used to work for the old USIA Office of Research and did exactly those kinds of surveys. And you guys do a great job with that. I mean, it is, and to me, this is absolutely devastatingly striking. And the question it raises for me is how much people are aware of this. I mean, I'd almost like to see you do a question on one of your other polls about whether people are aware of this phenomenon. I'd be very curious to know how much Americans are aware of this.
Yeah,
And
that's a brilliant idea. I'm as confident, I think, as you seem to be in asking that question, that it would be distressingly less aware than you would hope Americans
yeah, I'm pretty
would
sure
be.
that very few people know this, but I think it would be interesting to find that out.
Well, and it's, you know, it fits into a really interesting meta narrative. Actually, I'm going to do it with slides in a minute, related to trust. And so, you know, for our way of thinking, there are at least 3 useful ways to be thinking about trust and its implications for global as well as United States culture. One is interpersonal trust, and we spend some time doing that. We'd spend even more time looking at institutional trust, which is catastrophically low in some senses. But this notion about being able to trust the United States around the world is sort of an interesting sort of side angle into this. And you're right. It's always been a really interesting proxy measure for all kinds of things that happen in the world and all kinds of ways that Americans think about global institutions and multilateral institutions and things like that. So that's a great point, and that's a great question.
Pretty good proxy for our soft power, if nothing else, I would think.
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
Brilliant. So how are we doing? Just keep going. Okay. So here's a little bit of a backgrounder on this Pathways project. So in November, we did something that we hadn't done for about 5 years, which is to march people through a fairly long list of media properties and ask people about their awareness of those news media properties, ask people about their trust in those properties, and then began to use that as an analytical variable for how people are getting information, whether they live in echo chambers, things like that. And so this is a sort of overview reading about these 30 main sources of news, and you'll see a list of them in a minute. It's striking to see that since the majority of them are what you would be calling mainstream news sources, Democrats are much more likely to trust them, and Republicans have their own sort of preferences and trust in their media diet. And here's how that shows up. So for the Republican array of sources that they trust the most include Fox News, Hannity Radio, Limbaugh Radio, Breitbart. Interestingly enough, there's a statistically significant level of trust in PBS, the BBC, and the Wall Street Journal. And they don't so much trust the array of news organizations that are on the right. You know, the obverse of that chart is this one for Democrats, where Democrats have high levels of trust in sort of mainstream media kinds of sources, and distrust in an array of conservative serving platforms. And so that in and of itself is kind of interesting. But then we arrayed these media properties by their audiences. We didn't do content analysis. So what I'm sure you would hear when you do talk to others in this media series about the kind of information, particularly news organizations, put out. Many of the organizations that are in the mainstream media say that we don't try to give any political inflection or partisan inflection to our work. But if you look at the audiences for the work, in other words, whether the audience itself skews left or center or right, you can array these media properties on a scale like this one. And so we do that by audience preference, and you can see that there's an intuitive sanity and face value to the array of these things. And of course, the standard question that so many people in media studies, communication studies now care about is echo chambers. And it's 20% of Democrats and those who lean towards that party turn only to outlets in the blue, and 18% of Republicans turn only to outlets in the red. And it's not quite echo chambers, but it's not a bad proxy for how many people sort of live their lives in a preference, and especially in a news environment, to certain kinds of spaces. I'm sure the scholars who are on this call and who've done this work or are familiar with this work know that the vast majority of this work shows that Americans aren't in echo chambers. If they're heavily engaged with politics and heavily engaged with news, they are deeply aware of the positions and personalities who are on the other side of the spectrum from there. And they often share sources. They're a share of Fox trusting viewers who are very much into CNN and MSNBC and the New York Times and NPR. But obviously their motives for looking at that kind of material are different from those who are fans of and trusting of those kind of media. But the basic story in America, or probably in most places, isn't a echo chamber story. It's a trust story. And so what sources you trust are a bigger determinant of how you sort of see the world and what information you score as trustworthy, rather than where your awareness about news is coming from, and whether it comes from eclectic kinds of partisan sources or uniform kinds of partisan sources. And so there are now ways that we can use these data to look not only at sort of partisan differences in information, but also sources of differences tied to people's sources of information. So this is actually a relatively recent finding. It's an early September survey where we asked people about about mail-in voting and the degree to which they think it might be a major problem, a minor problem, or not a problem at all. As you can see, in the overall population, about a quarter of Americans said it might be a major problem. 27% said it might be a minor problem. 27% might not be a problem at all, and about a fifth are not sure at all. And once you sort of look at partisanship, you see that Republicans and Democrats and Fox viewers sort of the left-leaning audiences have different sources, and they have different perceptions about the degree to which mail-in ballots are an issue or not. As you can see, Republicans and Fox viewers are worried about it and more likely to score it as a major problem, and Democrats and left-leaning audiences for news sources are not very likely to see it as a problem at all. This is a pattern that's going to show up in a whole bunch of the other data we show. In this survey, we followed up on a question we asked in a February survey. So we asked about people's awareness about QAnon, and when you combine the answers for "I've heard a lot" or "heard a little," you see the material that I got in the left diagram over there. And in February, about 23% of all Americans had heard at least a little bit about QAnon, 28% of Democrats, 18% of Republicans. Now those numbers have jumped up substantially, doubled or more in most cases. And interestingly enough, I hope I included this slide. Yeah, I did. So there's higher level of awareness among folks who are relying on those liberal audience media publications, which are tending to actually cover QAnon a little bit more than the right-leaning audience publications. And so we asked a brand new question, not of all respondents, but broke it out by who were aware of it. Is QAnon a very bad thing, a somewhat bad thing, a somewhat good thing, or a very good thing? And 41% of Republicans who are aware of QAnon think it's somewhat good or very good, compared with 7% overall of the Democrats and leaning Democrats who feel that way. Of course, 3/4 of Democrats think it's a very bad thing. And then we asked a follow-up question, well, as far as you know, how does the president think about QAnon? And again, there's big differences. The Republicans are, 27% say they think he supports the group, compared with 81% of Democrats who think he supports the group. Republicans are much more likely than Democrats to say that he does neither. He has views neither one way or the other about QAnon, and a third of Republicans who have heard about QAnon are not sure what the president's views are. So again, it's really interesting, fits back into that last question about awareness and knowledge about something, and how it's exposure itself is a determinant in many cases about how people are thinking about issues. And certainly now there's a partisan tone to the way that people are aware of it and then are judging it itself, QAnon itself, and the president's position related to it. This is data that we released 2 hours ago. We did a survey last week and put out the findings now. And again, sort of we asked in May whether people, we asked an up-down question, or actually, no, we asked a four-way question, would people get a vaccine? And in May, we found that 42% would definitely get a vaccine, 30% would probably get a vaccine, 16% would probably not get a vaccine, and 11% definitely would not get a vaccine. The number of people now who are even willing to express some possibility that they would get a vaccine has dropped from that 72% to 51%. That drop has been, striking across the board. There's the Republicans have dropped, Democrats have dropped, but it speaks to the sort of broader confusion there is in the information environment, the broader confusion there is about the sort of state of the exploration for the vaccine, the level of trust that people have in the president and the public health agencies about reporting whether a vaccine is going to be tested the right way and distributed in an equal way. And so we asked those people who probably are definitely not going to get a vaccine, what's going on with them? Are these major or minor reasons why you are not going to do this? As you can see, concern about the side effects of a vaccine and concern about its efficacy were cited by close to 3/4 of Americans as a major reason why they would not get a vaccine. A third of those who don't want to get it say they don't think they need it. That's a major reason, and altogether 55% of those who say as a major and minor reason say they just don't think they're going to need to get it. And some people are worried about the cost of it too. I should tell you, since we're among friends, even though this might be a public event, we are going to put out some very related data to this on Americans thinking about contact tracing programs. We haven't yet released those findings, but it shows a similar, and these are not trend questions, it was the one and only time we asked about it, but it shows quite similar trends in skepticism, worry. A lot of people are nervous about what happens to their data if they turn it over to authorities and things like that. So there's and the technology angle in contact tracing is pretty interesting in and of itself. People don't answer their phone when a stranger number calls. And if there's a voicemail, they tend to listen to it. But even again, they're not necessarily sure that they're going to respond when somebody leaves a voicemail. And one of the major factors related to that is that a lot of Americans think that scams are omnipresent online and on phones. And they either can tell stories of their own horror examples or neighbors or things that they've heard about where people try to scam information, personal information out of respondents and then exploit it for all kinds of reasons to steal money and steal credit and steal credit cards and things like that. So contact tracing programs are operating in a very challenging environment where even people's willingness to answer the phone is in question. And even when they do encounter someone from a public health agency, are not necessarily willing to talk to that person about where they've been, who they've been with, what kind of location data might exist on their cell phone and things like that. So stay tuned for that set of headline findings from Pew, but it does fit into this environment of despair and wariness and confusion that's sort of dominant in the culture now. And why don't I stop on that just to make sure there aren't, you're still with me and I'm not talking too fast? Okay, now after that part of the story, we are getting back to the sort of grand narrative about Americans' trust in government. We've asked a new battery of questions on this subject in the past month, and these are the latest findings. So historic lows, really, if you look back over the trend data extending into the Gallup era of the I'm sorry, I didn't leave a timeline here, but that 73% is sort of post-war height of confidence in government. and then it's dropped to pretty consistent levels. There was a little bit of a bump after 9/11 in 2001, but it's now sort of settled at this deeply unhappy level of trust that the federal government will do the right thing most of the time. And one of the things we hadn't done in years gone by, but we started to do after the 2016 election, was to try to understand a little bit more what's going on when people say they don't trust the government. So one level of data that I'm not going to show shows that actually when you ask about different agencies in the government and you ask about different functions of government, Americans are still relatively happy with lots of different agencies. The most interesting data that has had now incredibly great attention in the past 3 months has been our finding that the post office has incredibly wide public support and trust and confidence. And in years gone by, that was a finding that didn't interest anyone, and now the people's confidence in the post office is a first order question for the culture, and our data are being cited in that. But it speaks to this larger question about when you unpack the idea of what government means and what government does, there are lots of ways that people have quite nice things to say about the government and quite trusting things to say about the government. One of the other ways that we've tried to understand this phenomenon a bit more fully is to ask people about different dimensions or functions of government and dimensions of democracy. And so we have found this consistent series of gaps. When you ask Americans, should the government do this and be good at it, you usually get relatively high readings, even on things like helping people get out of poverty, with the thing on the lower right there. Not everybody thinks that. Not everybody thinks that's a big function of government, but a significant majority do. But then you ask, how are we doing along those dimensions? And there are almost invariably enormous aspiration gaps between how well we think we should do, or how well people think the government should do, and how it's doing now. And so this is our latest data that's, again, sort of as recent as within the past month. There's even a gap when it keeps keeping the country safe from terrorism. Obviously, there are huge gaps related to managing the immigration system, now managing the threats to public health and things like that. But again, sort of across the board, the gap between our aspiration and our performance is pretty striking and pretty across the board. One of the new things that we found when we talk to people about the attributes of democracy, again, we get relatively high readings that people think that a central element of any high-functioning democratic system is that people have the right to peacefully protest. And since the protests after the George Floyd killing have now become a dominant part of the national culture and conversation, Republican views on the importance of the right to protest and Democrats' views about whether people are able to protest successfully and peacefully are very much changing. Even in the past 2 years, Republicans are less likely than they were 2 years ago to say it's very important for the country that people can protest peacefully. And Democrats now are considerably less likely to say that the possibility of having peaceful protests in the country is recognized and realized in this country. Going back to the left side of this chart, you can see where we've asked about other dimensions of democracy where there are particularly striking partisan differences. Republicans and Democrats just don't feel the same about the country doing very or somewhat well when it comes to giving everyone an equal opportunity to succeed, to balance power between government agencies, to give rights and freedoms, to make sure that the rights and freedoms of all people are respected, that elected officials face serious consequences for misconduct, and that the government is transparent. Republicans are in all those dimensions more likely than Democrats that we're doing those things relatively well. I already showed you that one. I already showed you that one. Am I going backwards here? Oh, sorry, I'm going backwards. And now we're getting, this is a post-pandemic question where we began to sort of look at, well, what are people's expectations, even as early as April, about the impact of the pandemic on the election? And 2/3 of all Americans said it was very likely or somewhat likely that the outbreak would significantly disrupt Americans' ability to vote in the election. There were partisan differences in that, but even half of Republicans were embraced that possibility that things would be disrupted. And now the partisan differences show up when you ask other kinds of questions about election administration, the legitimacy of the ballot, and the outcome of the election. Half of supporters say it would be difficult to vote in this election, but Republicans are thinking that they will not have a difficult time voting in this election, although now they're thinking it's somewhat more likely than it was when we asked this question in 2018. And Democrats are considerably more likely to think it will be difficult. In the lower right there, you see 60% of Democrats and those who lean Democratic are thinking that it will be difficult to vote this year. And so the last, I guess 58 or 59 days of the campaign this is going to be another one of the narratives that runs alongside it and has a partisan connection to it. Why don't I stop there too, because the elections, I'm going to segue now into other kinds of issues. Any other questions? No. Okay. Well, here's how. Oh, I'm sorry. Here's how we've been looking at the life of Americans in the midst of the pandemic. In this case, we were asking about acts of discrimination or acts of racism in the culture. And that you can see that since the pandemic in particular, and this was framed as a pandemic question more than a racial justice question, Asian Americans were considerably more likely than white Americans to say that people acted as if they were uncomfortable around them. They'd been the subject themselves of slurs or jokes, and they feared that someone might threaten or physically attack them. Then we asked a separate question about whether they are worried others might be suspicious of them if they wear a mask in public. One of the sort of meta-narratives that we were continually hearing from Black Americans was that they were getting potentially more hassled because they were covering their faces, as they had been advised to do in the wake of the coronavirus, but they were also having it taken out on them and having challenges forced their way when they took steps to protect themselves that way. We also asked about experiencing an act of racism. The percent saying that it is more common for people to express racist or racially insensitive views around different groups in the society compared to when the before the coronavirus outbreak. You can see Asians in particular were likely to say that they had experienced expressions of racist or racially insensitive views, but it's an omnipresent thing in many cases for Black Americans and for Hispanic Americans. We have also asked questions since Memorial Day about support for Black Lives Matter. We asked a follow-up question, a similar question just a week ago to one we asked in June. And you can see there's a little bit of less support for the Black Lives Matter movement between September and the previous question we asked in June. The slippage has come mainly among Republicans and to some degree among white Americans. So there's a way in which there was a sort of rallying around the movement as it was exploding around the country after the George Floyd killing, and there's a sort of different level of sentiment now, particularly after the summer and the Republican convention and things like that. We also asked a series of questions in June, not in September, about people's experiences with police, and it just a staggering number. These are actually questions that we had asked in a survey that we did in 2018, and so we have some trend data on this. But the number, particularly of young Black men or Black adults altogether, Black men altogether, almost 2/3 have been unfairly stopped by police because of their race and ethnicity, and 1/4 of Hispanic men have faced that. 1/3 of Black women have faced that, and so it's a deep part of our culture and the experiences that some of our fellow citizens have been having. And then we asked people again in that June survey, not in the September survey, we asked about people, why Americans thought that the protests were going on. And it was interesting to see that sort of across different racial and ethnic groups, there was a strong, consistent opinion about anger over the death of George Floyd and his arrest by police and then killing by police. And that being a motive. The tensions between Black people and police was also widely cited. Blacks were particularly likely to talk about long-standing concerns about treatment of Black people. Again, some people we asked the question about some people taking advantage to engage in criminal behavior. There was some degree of also support for that idea and as being one of the motives behind the protests. So that's the end of sort of my rundown of the more recent stuff and how it fits into the culture. I can now go through a bunch of more contextual stuff. We could do questions. Wenhong, what would you like to be doing? I've got a lot more on a lot of different stuff. Should I go maybe to my internet slides just to show, because I would deliver on the promise of talking about here's one just to. This is an amazing finding. In a survey, we found that 1/5 of Americans had moved in the wake of the pandemic, and now there are census data showing from July that more 18 to 29-year-olds are living at home with their parents than was the case at the height of the Great Depression. And it's one of the most heavily trafficked pieces of content on our website now, because it's such a stunning thing about how the culture has been affected by the pandemic. Here's my internet stuff. But again, I'm going to stop if you really want to go through other stuff. I've given you a feast here, and I don't want to shut people off.
Lee, I think you have perfect timing. So I think right now is the time for questions from our participants.
Yes.
Yeah.
And chances are I also have a slide that might relate to your questions if I can scroll through them.
Any questions? Alexis has one question.
So I am listening to these slides and I'm feeling rather downtrodden. I also, let me just couch this in the fact that I've been working from home since March and have not seen other human beings. So it could just be the mood, but I often enjoy the perspective of people who have been working in these arenas. This is just one snippet of a moment of time that we're looking at right now. And I guess I'm curious, all of these data are so fascinating. And I am curious to put these data in context with other trends, other social trends of the past, to perhaps temper the fact that the partisanship, the growing partisanship, and not only that, but the belief that the other is somehow bad or someone we should avoid and not speak to, makes my throat tighten up a little bit. So I don't know if you have any words on perhaps the temporality of this moment in your experience.
Here's one slide that starts with a hopeful thought. And we did this in June, but we have a trend question. We only highlighted 2 data points here, but even after the social justice protests broke out, we asked a question about life in the future. And the most hopeful groups that we could see in the data were Black Americans and Hispanic Americans, who think that the future will be better. And part of that seemed to be related to this, to the hope that the protests that emerged after the Floyd killing were bringing in a different kind of moment, for instance, than the Ferguson, Michael Brown killing. And that something bigger seemed to be happening, and that maybe the pandemic was part of the way that people were taking stock and maybe thinking more about these kinds of issues. And these are consistent with other ways that we ask sort of future questions, that we pick up the things that a lot of other analysts have picked up, that white Americans, and particularly less well-educated white Americans, don't think the future is going to be so great. Almost every other group thinks it's going to be way better than the past, by significant margins. And they talk about their kids and how their kids will have a better world to come into. They talk about how there's just this rise, particularly at places like yours, where education is available and offered to and serving the purposes of people who are in the past generations of their family have not necessarily had those opportunities. Interesting way technology figures in the story. I mean, people have lots of concerns about technology, and I had a raft of slides about how techlash is a big and growing thing, particularly related to social media and how odious people think it is. But there are ways that people, even in the midst of that, can talk about, and again, sort of Black Americans leading the pack in sort of saying social media is fabulous for letting my voice be heard, for holding political figures accountable, for surfacing new ideas, for building movements, for finding allies. And so, that's an absolutely consistent narrative. When you ask questions about the upside of social media, front of the line is Black Americans, closely, relatively followed by Hispanics. The other thing that people will talk about, and I don't know how it's going to come out, and I think we're doing both elite surveys on this and popular surveys. People think we might work through the pandemic in a way that's not going to end up terribly much. I mean, and they start with inequality. They worry about the workers who can afford to stay home and do their jobs from home and be potentially even more productive using technology compared with people who need to show up for places and physically move things around and physically serve people and things like that. But sort of right next to that narrative is a hope that that people will be able to empower themselves to get things, to see things, to share things, to buy things, to go places, or at least experience things that they might not others. So that sort of the fill in the blank side of the culture. Many people can say that, particularly with education, particularly with healthcare, and even with sociality, they're thinking that sort of new possibilities have opened up because of this. So there's a hopeful note.
Lee, on the slide that you put up, there's a storyline there that you didn't talk about, which is something I've been thinking about, because I hear more than most people. I was born in a very conservative part of the country and still know a lot of friends and family from there. So if you look at that brown line from lean Republican, that plunges, and I think in terms of where they see the future going. And from the people I know who are more conservative and white, they have an almost apocalyptic feeling right now that their lives are about to get remarkably worse. I'm wondering if so I think that line in some ways makes it clear. I wonder if you pick that up in other parts of your polling, and I wonder if you could speak to that a bit, because it's something I'm trying to figure out, I must say, both for my dealing with my friends and family, et cetera, how to helpfully speak about that with them, but also just to understand the political implications of that.
Yeah, well, sort of the circumstantial evidence that I just showed you on this is not good. The QAnon findings are just part of potentially linked to that story. And as I mentioned, one of the research units at Pew focuses on religion and its role in public life, and as well as the role of atheists, agnostics, and people who don't want to declare a religious affiliation. And the white evangelical community is feeling the way you describe, and yet, and so there's just no denying that. What maybe you can sort of hold out the possibility of hope on that front is if the election results are so overwhelming that there's not any question that the culture has sort of chosen sides. That to the degree that people think that at least games are being played, or something was stolen, or some trickiness was built into the process, there's some possibility that might be helpful in the broad thing. But the other thing that I pick up, and it's maybe related to I'm sorry, Alex's question, is when you talk to Americans about trust, they basically say it's hopeless at the national level. The way to rebuild trust in this country is to start at the grassroots. And if you start getting people to interact with their neighbors and to solve local problems, and forget that they have different views on sort of broad cultural issues that drive everybody slightly crazy, that the shoulder to shoulder piece of this might be helpful and might be trust building and might eventually lead to an upwards motion in the allocation of trust. There's no way at the moment that lots of Americans can see that you're going to solve the trust in broad institutions problem. There are lots of ways that they can talk about how at the community level and even at the regional level they can make common cause with their neighbors, even if they don't understand them, and even if in the context of politics, one of the sort of big aftermath effects of the 2016 election was people waking up and thinking, I didn't wake up in my country. I had no idea that this was going on. And so I think there's a way now that there's a clearer sense of the divisions in the country, and a sense that certain strategies are probably off limits to tackling that. And there are some other ways to be thinking about it. The other thing that they say is, when we ask them, can the trust problem be solved? And they're convinced it can. Overwhelming numbers of Americans think it can be solved. And some of it is just, the other side shuts up or whatever. But a lot of people can talk in relatively sophisticated ways about this sort of grassroots emanation of trust.
Interesting.
I should have thrown in more hopeful slides.
We definitely need some hopeful, optimistic message right now.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lee, so much for this very informative talk. It gives us exactly the background of what Americans are thinking, doing with the internet and other digital media technologies. In 5 minutes, we are going to shift to the graduate student part of our event. We will talk with our graduate students about professional development, in particular in this new environment. Everyone is welcome to stay, but it will be more informal, more about career development. Any questions before we move on to that part?
I can think of one more hopeful thing. I can't believe I didn't start with this. The generation story is a really interesting story, and Gen Z and younger millennials too are just such a different group and such an open group, and show levels of tolerance that we've never seen in the polling era. Show levels of sort of progressive thought on all kinds of cultural issues. They don't trust institutions, and maybe that's a tonic and beneficial thing, but they are really confident about their own networks, their own power to maybe make a splash and to create their own future and to make the world a different place. And we're in part because they're just becoming a big enough cohort in our 18 and over sampling to pick them up. But everything we see as we do a little bit of work with teenagers, and then that the oldest Gen Z people I think are now 23. They might have 23. So watching generational change is an amazing story, and younger millennials in particular are already sort of doing this. What you got to worry about, of course, and for those folks, is that the sort of classic American career trajectory, community building trajectory, settling down, settling in, finding your, settling on your identity kind of thing. Those things are just wildly disrupted by the disruptions in the economy, disruptions in social and education, and other signs of this kind of social phenomenon that are hitting those folks particularly hard.
Thank you everyone for participating.
Yeah, thank you.
Again, and you guys welcome to stay. And this part will be more focusing on how our graduate students can learn from Lee and his career. Thank you.